Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So today I'm continuing with part two of my discussion of the uh, so-called Freedom Convoy in Canada and talking about similar events that have happened elsewhere and how there's kind of a common thread, there's a connection between them. So yeah, I came across an interesting article written by uh, Ben Norton, uh, who was with the Gray Zone and has started a new outlet called Multipolarista, and his colleague Brian Meyer. And the title of the article is From Canada to Brazil Rich Right Wing Elites Are Astroturfing, quote, Trucker Protests. Supported by wealthy right wing elites, so called trucker protests, led by non truckers, um, as I discussed last time, have parallelized the capitals of Brazil and Canada in less than 6 months. The campaigns have many similarities, including some of the same well funded conservative networks. Um, so, this sort of thing has a history that goes back well beyond that. But let me just uh, hit some highlights from this article. As I was telling you last time, the situation in Canada is that the so-called Freedom Convoy was in opposition ostensibly to vaccine mandates that required that truckers coming in from the United States be vaccinated in order to cross the border into Canada. But there's the exact same regulation going in the other way. Truckers coming from Canada have to be vaccinated in order to enter the United States. So, it was kind of pointless for these individuals, if this was a real point of their demonstration, to be protesting this particular vaccine mandate in Canada when there's the same vaccine mandate in the United States for that particular uh, group. And in reality, as I talked about last time, nearly 90% of truckers in Canada are vaccinated. Um, so while this protest was going on, overwhelming majority of truckers were working or trying to, unless they were stuck at the border, unable to cross because the uh, protesters set up blockades at most border locations. Um, and as I was just alluding to, this isn't the first time that this so-called trucker convoy tactic has been used. It's the latest example of a strategy being developed by well-funded right-wing networks across the Americas. Um, the convoy in Ottawa is, in fact, eerily similar to an astroturf campaign organized just a few months ago in Brazil, in the capital, Brasilia, by rich supporters of uh, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro's, which I assume is a very, very right wing president who was a former uh, military officer in Brazil's military dictatorship back a few decades ago. And a trucker protest in Brazil in 2018 paralyzed distribution networks for weeks. And initially, it had its roots in complaints about hikes in the cost of diesel fuel, uh, caused by neoliberal economic policies imposed um, after the um, Workers' Party government was displaced in essentially sort of a nonviolent coup where they trumped up a scandal against some of the leading figures in the Workers' Party, including the president, Dilma Rousseff, and the former president, Lula da Silva. Um, and, initially, I mean, that sounds like a good thing. Protests against, hikes to the cost of diesel fuel that were making it more expensive for both trucking companies and perhaps truckers themselves. But it was ultimately hijacked in pretty short order by wealthy conservative elites. And 2018 was a year of the presidential election. And so Brazil's corporate media, who are very pro, they're very right wing generally speaking, they turned the trucker protest into a giant campaign commercial for Bolsonaro, who, not only is this, essentially fascist head of state, or at that time presidential candidate, but had very close ties to the United States. The first head of state to ever visit CIA headquarters, and just in general, has pursued very, very right-wing policies, including basically trying to resist any efforts to control COVID infections. And as you might know, Brazil has had among the highest rates of COVID infections and deaths in the world. And Bolsonaro proudly refuses to wear masks and refuses to get vaccinated, and is very much against mask and vaccine mandates. So, same thing happened again in Brazil in 2021. In early September of 2021, Brazil held a conservative political action conference attended by Bolsonaro's son Eduardo. Donald Trump Jr. was supposed to attend in person, but attended via video link. CPAC Brazil also featured Jason Miller, a former Trump senior advisor and close ally of Steve Bannon, the far-right political operative who was a Trump administration official for a little while. Let's see. So I believe that's Jason Miller there on the left, and Bolsonaro's in the middle, and that's his son on the right. Just a few days after CPAC Brazil, on September 7th, a group of truckers occupied the National Esplanade. I guess that's like a plaza? Briefly paralyzing the capital, Brasilia, and leading thousands of Bolsonaro supporters in what initially appeared to be a planned storming of the Supreme Court building. The trucker protest was organized by a man who called himself Zé Trovão. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. And it turned out he's not actually a trucker. He doesn't even have a driver's license. But he got lots of funding from Eduardo Bolsonaro, the president's son. And in addition to that, most of the truckers who showed up for the protest were actually hired to be there. They were paid. And things kind of fizzled out. And Miller, the Trump advisor, was detained at the airport by federal police, who questioned him over his role in the destabilization of the country. Because at the time, Bolsonaro had not been elected yet. There was a kind of a centrist, neoliberal member of the Workers' Party who was in office at that time. So that, there's a lot of similarities between this campaign where conservative elites use truckers or people pretending to be truckers to disrupt things and try to push their agenda, and the same thing happened in Canada. Let's see. Gonna skip down a little bit here. Um, okay, well, there's more to the story in Brazil than that because it turns out that this idea of using truckers or alleged truckers to engage in protests that kind of shut things down economically and are backed by right wing elites and push their agenda. According to journalist Seymour Hersh, prior to the 1973 coup in Chile, sorry, did I say Brazil? I apologize. So back in 1972, I guess it would be, and 73 maybe. Um, Let me see what the date of that is. Okay, fall of 1972. All right. The CIA funded this protest back in. That's really swell. uh, Late 1972, the CIA spent millions of dollars funding this trucker strike. And that was part of a destabilization campaign against Salvador Allende, the newly elected socialist president of um, Chile. I think he was elected in 70. Okay, so not that newly elected, but anyway. So uh, as U.S. officials put it, they wanted to make Chile's economy scream. So there was this campaign to destabilize the economy, which was very successful. Uh, and that set the stage for the 1973, September 11th, by the way, 1973, military coup carried out by Augusto Pinochet. Um, and so, what was I going to say? Um, and roughly at that same time, a little bit after, Jair Bolsonaro over in Brazil was a military officer in the dictatorship that held power in Brazil from the 1960s for several decades after that. So there were kind of a mixture of reactions to the 2018 protests. Um, Certainly, a lot of the truckers, especially owner operators, were very supportive because diesel fuel prices were rising rapidly and cutting into their profit margin. But most of Brazil's labor unions didn't endorse the protest um, because, due to the participation of so many trucking company owners, they viewed it as more of a lockdown than a strike and didn't feel like it clearly represented the demands of the working class. Um, but diesel prices continue to go up, and the truckers quickly gained the support of much of the Brazilian middle class. A history professor who reported on the early days of the protest said there's no unified set of demands. The movement is not hegemonic from a social or ideological point of view. Um, there's a group of truckers who support Bolsonaro, another group that's demanding a return to military dictatorship, and others who are asking for free elections now and freedom for Lula, Lula da Silva, the former president of Brazil, who was at the time in prison on trumped up charges. So he was unable to run for um, president. She went on to say there's a clear attempt being made by the business class, which is exerting a greater influence on negotiations with the government to appropriate the truckers' demand. Um, Brazil's conservative media oligarchies framed the strike to damage the reputation of the Workers' Party by only filming the most reactionary elements, who were either clamoring for a return to the dictatorship or supporting Bolsonaro or both. Um, and at that time, the Brazilian Landed Workers Movement, the MST, um, started trying to influence the protesters. They used political organizing tactics influenced by educator Paulo Freire to try and listen to and learn from the truckers' experiences. They then explained that they believed that diesel fuel prices were so high because the people who were setting diesel fuel prices were kind of rigging things. And the solution suggested by the company owners, lowering taxes, would hurt them because it would result in starving funds for um, government programs. And gradually over time, they were able to undermine support among the truckers for the strike. Um, okay. So, going back to the Canadian strike, I just want to briefly remind you what I talked about last time as far as who was backing and who was involved in organizing the Canadian truck convoy protests. Um, again, the protests came about as a result of the Canadian government beginning in January to require truckers crossing the border with the U.S. to be vaccinated against COVID-19, which for most truckers was not a problem. Almost all of them were vaccinated. And, of course, as I mentioned, it was an issue in both directions crossing the border because the U.S. has the same regulations. But right wing networks inside Canada and elsewhere decided this was a great opportunity to stage a protest, kind of a fig leaf or a maple leaf, as you will, for their real ambitions to further their influence. And a lot of members of far right groups, including white nationalists and Islamophobes, such as the one of the key leaders of the Convoy, one of the key organizers, whose name is Pat King, this wonderful fellow called the leader of the New Democratic Party, Jagmeet Singh, a terrorist, and told him to go back to his own country. And Singh is actually, a native Canadian born in Scarborough, Ontario. But according to one of the key members of the quote-unquote Freedom Convoy, Pat King, he was a terrorist who needed to go back to where he came from. Many of the people that were involved, as I was talking about the other day, weren't actually truckers. They were either, in many cases, owners of trucking companies or people who owned their own truck and were truckers, but were also owners. So kind of small business people, and also people who had nothing to do with the trucking industry. Most of the key organizers of this protest were not, in fact, truckers. Some of the leaders uh, came from Canadian police departments or military intelligence or the RCMP, which is kind of the Canadian equivalent of the FBI. Stephen Gowans, who's a leftist organizer in Canada, said those involved with organizing protests include former RCMP and military officers, hardly the kind of people who get involved in organizing left-wing pro-labor movements. Um, Right-wing and xenophobic message was ubiquitous at the convoy, and a few protesters even showed up with Nazi and Confederate flags. Countless photos and videos of the convoy show anti-communist signs, some bizarrely accusing Canada's centrist Prime Minister Trudeau of the Liberal Party of being a secret communist. And just to give you a flavor for some of the signage at the protests, communism has no home here. That's nice. A Confederate flag with a truck on it. More Confederate flags. That's Chelsea Hillier, who I mentioned the other day, a key supporter of the protests, and a member of Canada First, which is a white supremacist group in Canada. Another Nazi flag, Don't Tread on Me flag, along with some Fuck Trudeau signs. This was actually in Tennessee. Very overt expression of eugenics there. Sacrifice the Week reopened Tennessee. This was back in well, this is ancient history now, back when there were lockdowns in the United States. And in April of 2020, there were protests against them around mid-April in many states. Another sign from the Ottawa protests, Trump won. So actually there were quite a few people who had participated in the January 6th protests at the Capitol in the United States who went to this protest in Canada. One of the American supporters of the convoy is Batya Ungar Sargon, who is a journalist and a very well-known Zionist, and generally has pretty right-wing politics. She says Canada is now officially arresting dissidents. A country that considers itself a democracy arresting people for the crime of organizing a mass grassroots nonviolent protest should horrify each and every one of you. Surely we can all agree on that, whatever side of this you are on. I guess we can, according to her, we can't all agree on that in the case of Canada, but I don't suppose we would all agree on that in the case of Israel. She would disagree with us about a country that considers itself a democracy arresting people for organizing a mass protest is horrifying, because that's what Israel does. And so she wrote this article about it. Whatever. So, I mean, I'm going to ask, what would you do if, you went to a protest for some cause that you supported, and, you saw all these people who were, quite visibly, fascists or members of the far right, white supremacists, whatever. Would you ignore that? Would you make excuses for it? That's what as I termed them, ostrich left here in the United States has done. People like Jimmy Dore and Max Blumenthal, they just look the other way bury their head in the sand when they encounter evidence that, in fact, this protesting Canada, like others elsewhere, was organized and supported and attended by overwhelmingly far right people. Um, and among the many American supporters of this, I mentioned Tucker Carlson last time. He was selling T-shirts, making money off of it. Um, then there's Donald Trump. Let's see. Where is Mr. Trump? Donald Trump called Justin Trudeau a far left lunatic. Um, he said the Freedom Convoy is peacefully protesting the harsh policies of far left lunatic Justin Trudeau, who has destroyed Canada with insane COVID mandates. Um, let's see if Donald says anything else. Well, he had a statement. Let's have a look. Facebook and big tech are seeking to destroy the Freedom Convoy of truckers. The Freedom Convoy is peacefully protesting the harsh policies of far left lunatic Justin Trudeau, who has destroyed Canada with insane COVID mandates. Now, thankfully, the Freedom Convoy could be coming to D.C. with American truckers who want to protest Biden's ridiculous COVID policies. Facebook is canceling the accounts of Freedom Convoy USA, and GoFundMe is denying access to funds that belong to the Freedom Convoy. This is unacceptable and extremely dangerous in any country that values free expression. Blah, blah, blah. So back to the article by Ben Norton and I forget his colleague's name. They said many more of the protesters attacked China and blamed the Communist Party of China for the COVID-19 pandemic. So, basically, the protesters think that China either deliberately manufactured or unintentionally leaked the SARS-CoV-2 virus from the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab. Other protesters were seen with anti-Semitic signs blaming Jews for the crisis. A website created by supporters of the convoy listed right-wing conspiracy theorist David Icke and anti-vax groups as allies and encouraged readers to follow far-right outlets InfoWars and Rebel News. Okay. And, like I said, this phenomenon has been going on all over the world. It seems that the far right in countries throughout the world has kind of latched on to the anti-vax movement or anti-mandate movement, if you will, as well as anti-mask, as a way to sort of promote their agenda because they figure, even though it's a minority position, being against vax mandates will have more popular appeal than their white supremacist fascist agenda. As the pandemic has spread across the globe, the far right has been at pains to undermine vital public health measures. From fomenting rejection of face masks to fierce and sometimes violent opposition to vaccination efforts, white supremacists and fascists have spawned a veritable death cult of coronavirus denial. It's clear that fascists are playing a leading and highly influential role in the anti vax movement. Researchers recently analyzed some 500,000 comments on Telegram, which is a social media platform that you know, an awful lot of right wingers frequent. Um, I know some of us on the left are on it too, but we're definitely not the majority. Um, One of the channels on Telegram experienced a tenfold increase in subscribers. One of the right-wing channels when it's focused its efforts on COVID-19 conspiracy theories. Posts that were investigated, quote, downplayed the severity of the coronavirus or pushed conspiracy theories about its origins, with overt and extreme racism frequently woven into the discussions. Many of the posts contain hate speech directed at Jews, Asians, women, or other groups. One of these messages proclaimed that the Jews own COVID just like all of Hollywood. In September, fascists in Australia took the lead in such a mobilization protest, and one report paints a grim picture of what took place. In a frightening show of force, marauding fascist mobs have taken over the streets of Melbourne for 3 days running. They have smashed up union offices and occupied major arterials for hours. Earlier this month, German police thwarted a plan by anti-vaccination activists to murder the premier of the German state of Saxony. And this was linked to an increasingly violent pushback against COVID-19 vaccination plans. So there was an arson attack on a vaccination center in Saxony, and threatening letters, threatening bloody resistance against vaccination efforts were sent to various politicians and media outlets. And elsewhere in Europe, such as in France and Italy, for example, the far right has played a central role in organizing and leading protests. So you have supporters of Marine Le Pen, for example, playing a leading role in organizing anti-vax and anti-other public health measures protests there in France. And the January 6th people, kind of moved on from claiming that the last presidential election was stolen from Donald Trump to focus their energy on the vaccination issue. False information on the vaccines is being circulated in chat rooms frequented by all manner of right-wing groups, including the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Movement, a loose affiliation known for wanting to spark a second civil war, and various paramilitary organizations. And we can debate whether the Boogaloos are trying to start a civil war. Apparently, from what I understand, they just predict when it's going to happen, and claim they want to be ready. But anyway, videos and articles are being produced with menacing titles, such as doctors and nurses giving the COVID vaccine will be tried as war criminals. And as I may have mentioned last time, there have been anti-vaccine protests going on in many parts of Canada, taking place at hospitals and harassing healthcare workers as well as patients. The People's Party, led by Maxime Bernier, which is a far right party in Canada, well to the right of the Conservative Party. To its right, the Conservative Party's pretty far right. The People's Party deliberately cemented its alliance with the far right by enthusiastically supporting protests against public health measures during the last federal election. And in Canada as elsewhere, the trucker convoy phenomenon has precedent. Back in 2019, there was a trucker convoy, again organized by the far right, that was called United We Roll, and it was a protest in favor of the pipelines that were being constructed in Canada, which indigenous groups and many others were protesting against. Um, Tory leaders were drawn to the message of climate denial and resource extraction like moths to a flame. And as I mentioned last time, there's actually a separatist movement in Western Canada called Wexit, where some of the provinces in Western Canada, or they want some of the provinces in Western Canada to leave Canada and join the United States. So much of the opposition to vaccination draws on a distorted sense of individual freedom. The concept of freedom of choice is even pressed into service. Collective rights and responsibilities are roughly pushed aside, and the claim to bodily integrity is put before community safety. One sign at a U.S. protest against face masks, in fact, said, "My freedom is worth more than your life." It's very direct statement that they don't care about you there. Another major drawing card for the far right is the long-standing malignant fantasy of culling the supposedly inferior. The false idea that COVID is only a major problem for the elderly and those with serious health conditions has been used to suggest that the loss of that section of the population is a price worth paying for the sake of personal freedom and a return to business as usual. Oh, why am I on this? I'm sorry. And I showed you the sign there in Tennessee that actually said "sacrifice the weak." Um, and this is really a death cult. Um, okay, well, what about the people who oppose vaccine mandates? Oppose these protests and support vaccine mandates? Well, there are quite a few of them. The Green Party of Canada issued a statement on the so-called Freedom Convoy. The Green Party of Canada condemns the hatred, racism, misogyny, homophobia, and other disrespect for treasured Canadian institutions displayed by some of the participants in the so-called Freedom Convoy protest in Ottawa. We will always defend the right of citizens to assemble in peaceful protests, but what we have seen over the last 4 days is indefensible. And this was written on January 31st, so just at the very beginning of the protests, which, as I talked about last time, went on for over 3 weeks and totally made life unbearable for many people in the downtown Ottawa area. The catalog of outrages is long, well documented, and frankly appalling. Flying swastikas and Confederate battle flags, desecrating memorials to our veterans, stealing food from the homeless, and threatening local residents and businesses. Whatever legitimacy this protest may have had has been squandered by those images being beamed out of Ottawa. As the pandemic drags on, we recognize that many people are struggling while many more are tired and frustrated. But that doesn't justify this display of hate and anger in Ottawa. We call on the protesters to end the takeover of our national capital, and we urge all Canadians to follow the advice of public health officials and get vaccinated. The Communist Party of Canada also issued a statement. Freedom Convoy, a dangerous movement for the working class, but useful for the ruling class. The Communist Party of Canada views the Freedom Convoy as a public expression of the increasingly organized and assertive far right. The convoy is filled with Nazi and Confederate flags, election signs for Bernier of the far right People's Party, and all sorts of far right symbols. Okay, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll put a link to it. other parties too, you know, oppose these protests. So, as I talked about last time, that the Conservative Party of Canada largely supported the protests, but not only Trudeau's Liberal Party, but also the New Democratic Party um, and the Bloc Québécois, which are the uh, two. The Liberal Party and the Conservative Party are the two biggest parties in Canada, but Bloc Québécois and New Democratic Party are both much bigger than any third party in the United States. They get double-digit support. Pretty much every federal election, um, and you, uh, all three of those parties opposed the protests and support vaccine mandates. And remember, one of the leaders of the protests, Pat King, called Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the New Democratic Party, a terrorist. He said he should go back where he came from. And those sentiments are shared by the majority of Canadians, in fact. They support vaccine mandates. So, support in the 80% range for vaccination for healthcare workers and teachers and people taking public transportation, federal public servants. Um, Somewhat lower percentage support of vaccine passports to enter restaurants and gyms or other indoor spaces. But as you can see there, for all of the voters in Canada, regardless of what political party they were from or they supported, there was majority support for the uh, for vaccine mandates. The only uh, party where the voters had less than 80% support for most of these mandates was the Conservative Party. And similarly, the majority of Canadians opposed the convoy protests. They don't support the agenda of the convoy protests. So Batya Ungar Sargon, the Israel backer that I mentioned before, and deputy opinion editor of Newsweek, said, "Don't let the fact that the mainstream media is hiding this fool you. Canadians support the Freedom Convoy." Um, but in fact, let's see. Uh, According to the Angus Reid Institute poll, more than two-thirds of those surveyed strongly opposed the protesters' approach and behavior. 69% of respondents said they opposed the protesters themselves, their approach and behavior, versus 27% who said they were supportive of the protesters. 64% of respondents said they oppose the protesters' demand to end all pandemic restrictions. Remember, they nominally were protesting specifically vaccine mandates, but in fact, their demands included abolishing mask mandates and any other pandemic restrictions. So 64% of respondents said they opposed the protesters' agenda. 33% said they supported it. 72% said the protesters have made their point and should go home now. Now being February 15th, when this article was written. 22% said the protesters should stay in Ottawa and other protest sites until their demands are met. Similar findings in other polls. Nearly two-thirds in this poll said they thought that the protesters were a selfish minority. 62% of respondents said they opposed the protest message of no vaccine mandates and fewer public health measures versus 32% who supported that message. 64% agreed that the convoy is a small minority of Canadians who are selfishly thinking only about themselves and not the thousands of Canadians who are suffering through delayed surgeries and postponed treatments because of the ongoing pandemic. And that's one thing that it doesn't get discussed much, but you know, not only do vaccinations reduce the likelihood of infection, although they don't prevent it entirely by any means, they also greatly reduce the likelihood of hospitalization. Because the reason why so many hospitals have been overcrowded during surges in the pandemic, preventing people from getting surgeries and other needed treatments, is that so many people have wound up in a hospital because they were unvaccinated. Ipsos, a strong majority disagreed with the goals of the protests. Maru, nearly two-thirds favor the military getting involved in ending the protests. 64% agree with the statement that Canada's democracy is being threatened by a group of protesters and they must be stopped immediately. Now, we could certainly debate whether that's an appropriate way of intervening or whether the way that the government actually intervened was appropriate, where they temporarily froze the bank accounts of leading organizers of the protests and participants who engaged in mayhem of some sort. Some of the leftist groups that I mentioned earlier or mentioned last time, in fact, opposed the enactment of the Emergencies Act by Justin Trudeau and Parliament, which allowed the measures to be taken that were taken, and thought that something short of that could have been done to end the protests. It's hard to say. But in any case, the majority of the Canadian public opposed the goals of the protests and the protests themselves and wanted the protests to end. The World Socialist website interviewed a number of individual Canadian workers about the Freedom Convoy protests. Members and supporters of the Cross Canada Educators Rank and File Safety Committee, so teachers, spoke to the World Socialist website about the ruling elite's backing for the convoy and adoption of a policy of letting the deadly virus run rampant. That's something I have neglected to mention, is that these protesters are protesting for the Canadian government to get rid of all these measures. And in fact, countries around the world, including Canada, were actually in the process of, for example, rolling back mask mandates. I think Canada still has a nationwide mask mandate, but they're planning on getting rid of it next month. And of course, that's already happened here in the United States. The county where I live is one of the few holdouts around the country and still having a mask mandate, but that's scheduled to end in 1 week. Anyway, let me read some of these. Malcolm, a teacher from British Columbia, said of the convoy, "We need to recognize it for exactly what its demands show it to be, viciously anti-worker. Despite noise and chattering about the sociological construct of the protesters and who they represent, they have been unequivocal about their demands: the immediate repeal by all levels of government of any and all pandemic restrictions. This represents nothing less than a frontal assault on the right of the working class to protect itself from a disease that has killed millions, likely tens of millions, in the past 2 years alone." Already conservative elements across the country, emboldened by the protests, are demanding that the few limited and entirely insufficient public health measures that do exist, such as mask and vaccine mandates, be banned. In future waves, of which there will be more, there is no serious scientific disagreement about this. Teachers will face a greater struggle than ever seen in previous waves to get these basic measures reintroduced. This will inevitably lead to more disease, more illness, and more death for workers and the most vulnerable and marginalized in society. There's a lot of these. An Ontario teacher described the convoy as deeply corrosively anti-democratic. He went on to say, it bears strong parallels with the dysfunction I observed during the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. For workers, we face a double problem. First, the protest is anti-worker and bears strong ties with right-wing fascist corporatism, both from Canada as well as being heavily influenced by the U.S. Second, in the necessary social response to this crisis, we risk this becoming a precedent that our government can use to deploy the measures being considered for the current debacle against legitimate civil protest workers. So, he's worried about the somewhat heavy-handed tactics that the Canadian government used to end the protests. They were really in a hurry to end it, both because the border shutdowns were really disrupting economic activity in Canada. Cut off. I think it was something like half of the trade between the U.S. and Canada, and also, as I talked about last time, residents of Ottawa were very upset about just how disruptive and really indeed terroristic in a lot of cases the conduct of a lot of the protesters was, and the fact that the police really didn't seem to be doing much about it and didn't seem in any hurry to end the protests. So they put a lot of pressure on the federal government to step in as well, which is there in Ottawa. A parent from Brampton, Ontario remarked, I am completely baffled by the so-called Freedom Convoy and its supporters calling for all mandates and restrictions to be dropped immediately. The Let It Rip group wants it all, but offers no compromises or solutions. And that's something that I've kept repeating on this show is, okay, you're against all these measures to prevent the reduce the spread of COVID. What are you for? You just want everybody to get it? I mean, why? That's just a guarantee of more people dying, more people developing serious illness and going to the hospital, overcrowding the hospitals, putting stress on healthcare workers, and more people developing long COVID, long-term illness. If the protesters actually think that wearing a mask, getting vaccinated, and following other health and safety protocols in order to protect the vulnerable members of our community equals persecution, then all I see are selfish, arrogant, irresponsible, entitled whiners who have zero clue as to what real tyranny or struggle is. They drive across the country to protest losing their freedom. The irony is lost on them. Fascism still exists. To deny its existence, as the ostrich left here in the United States does, is to give it a chance to flourish. Blind denial and intolerance often go hand in hand. It's not uncommon for people with far-right or fascist tendencies to gaslight people and dismiss very credible proof of fascism. Freedom does not exist in a vacuum, and living in a free society does not mean one is free from being held accountable for one's actions. Freedom without responsibility is an infringement on other citizens' freedom. All freedom comes with responsibilities. And just as a reminder, damn it, come on. Vaccines work. Even in the Omicron wave, these figures are from New York City. I've shown them before. Even during the Omicron wave, in early January, when the overwhelming majority of cases in New York were uh, Omicron, only a few left were Delta. You know, there's the rate of cases per 100,000 people um, per week for unvaccinated people, and there it is for vaccinated people. Hugely lower. Um, and more recently, as the wave subsided there in New York, cases came down a lot for everyone, but we're still much lower for vaccinated people than for unvaccinated people. Same with deaths. Vaccinated people were far less likely to die, and same with hospitalizations. Uh, so again, um, you know, uh, lower rates of infection, you know, or higher rates of vaccination mean lower rates of infection, and higher rates of vaccination mean lower rates of hospitalization. Both of which are arguments in favor of vaccine mandates. They protect people from getting sick in the first place and from getting seriously ill, which results in hospitals being overcrowded and the enormous stress that we've seen over the past 2 years on healthcare workers. Um, in many other countries, they also have vaccine mandates. Even in Brazil, where the president is far right, basically fascist individual, Jair Bolsonaro, um, who's been leading the charge against vaccine mandates and mass mandates too. You know, uh, Throughout Brazil, local officials are putting into place vaccine passports, defying the wishes of the president. And by the way, I'm going to cut this short, not you know, go through them, but polls in the United States also indicate that the majority of Americans, uh, not as big, not quite as big a majority as in Canada, but a majority of Americans, something like 60 to 65%, including a higher percentage than that of people of color in the United States, support vaccine mandates. Um, so I just want to close by reading kind of a summary of Canadians' feelings, or the majority of Canadians, anyways, feelings about the protests by someone, a activist named Stephen Gowans, who lives in Ottawa. He says some people believe the occupation of Ottawa is a left-wing pro-working class phenomenon. But that's hardly the view of trade unionists, community organizers, activists, and frontline workers here in the city of Ottawa. We see, feel, hear, and experience the occupation firsthand on the ground. That might be why we understand the occupation differently from some other people. Not as a left wing phenomenon and democratic expression, but as a far right movement of racists, evangelicals, union haters, and conspiracy minded lunatics, inspired and supported by the likes of Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Elon Musk. Um, Teamsters Canada opposes the occupation and calls COVID-19 the real enemy of truckers. Pierre LeBlanc, a local activist, recently wrote to Matt Taibbi of the Useful Idiots podcast, who's written a Substack article describing the occupation as Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Ceausescu moment. Ceausescu being the Romanian dictator who was uh, faced with mass protests as a result of his repression. And that doesn't really accurately characterize the occupation of Ottawa by a small minority of people. In his response to Taibbi, LeBlanc summed up quite effectively why the Ottawa occupation is an anti-labor far-right phenomenon. He said, "I despise Biden, the Clintons, and Trudeau as much as you do, and have often said so. But you totally misrepresent what is going on here. What is going on here in Ottawa and elsewhere in Canada is a full-on assault on Canadians by organized cadres of the extreme fundamentalist right-wing evangelicals, recently retired RCMP and other police officers, one of Trump's advisors, and a whole raft of Canadian and American conservatives and right-wing wingnuts, much of it financed by American so-called donors and whipped up by Fox News and many others. That you should associate your good name with them is sorely disappointing. Firstly, this is not a truckers' protest. It is a planned insurrection, a version of color revolutions not unlike what went on in Ukraine, Georgia, and Bolivia, and the ongoing attempted coup d'etat against Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, Peru, Chile, and many other countries around the world, and the defense and promotion of apartheid Israel. Real truckers who make their day living crossing the border are few and far between. Indeed, this occupation is deeply damaging to them and their families. They will be long degraded by this cynical hijacking of their good name and profession. Even at the Ambassador Bridge blockade, at the juncture of Detroit and Windsor, there are only 5 transport trucks involved in that blockade. The rest are the same people who have been attacking nurses, doctors, and other healthcare workers in front of hospitals for over 2 years, and who have suddenly discovered that using their souped-up half-ton toys, 4x4s, SUVs, and tractors as weapons is very effective. Much like Kissinger and Pinochet organized a fringe of truckers in Chile in 1973 to help overthrow the Allende regime. The cadres leading this are the who's who of Canada's supremacist extremists, linked up with former RCMP officers. They are holed up in the luxury of an Ottawa hotel with one of Trump's advisors, linked up with other yahoos of the U.S. oligarchy billionaire club, Elon Musk, etc. Collectively, they are highly experienced in sabotage, artificially creating infrastructure and economic gridlock to bring a society to its knees, and whipping up disaffected and naive citizens as their film extras, black shirts, and peons. The author of this article goes on to talk about how the lunatic far-right People's Party is foursquare behind the occupation, as are the interim leader and likely future leader of the country's Conservative Party, who is named Candace Bergen. When have the anti-union, pro-business, social conservative parties ever embraced an authentic pro-labor left-wing movement? So, I mean, ask yourself the same question about who's supporting the ongoing trucker convoy protest in the United States, which doesn't look like it's going to get a whole lot of media attention given events in Ukraine. But that's going on right now. What progressives or leftists or unions and so forth are supporting that? Other than the fringe element of the left that's anti-vax or at least anti-vax mandate, who is supporting it? The people that are supporting it are the pundits at Fox News and Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene and so on and so forth. That's who's backing this, just as in Canada. So he goes on to talk about the counter protest that was organized toward the end of the occupation, which involved a coalition of labor unions, community organizations, uh, activists um, who called for an end to the occupation, called for showing support for frontline workers, saying no to white supremacy, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and all other forms of hate that the convoy is directed at residents, as we talked about last time, calls for public health measures that protect our communities, and immediate support for workers who have lost income due to the convoy, um, paid sick leave, etc. A majority of Canadians and U.S. Americans support COVID-19 restrictions. Occupy Ottawa is not a grassroots working class movement, but an astroturfed corruption of far right billionaires whose aim is to pressure governments to lift all COVID restrictions and return to business as usual. As the Wall Street Journal, the mouthpiece of the hard right billionaire class, put it, the message of Canada's trucker protest is that it's time for the pandemic emergency orders to end. You know, again, he raises the question: how many legitimately left-wing, pro-worker, pro-democracy movements were ever endorsed by the Wall Street Journal? When has the Wall Street Journal ever endorsed a pro-worker protest? It never has. When you look at the slogans of these far right protests, their protests supposedly focused on ending vaccine mandates, and the cry from these protests is freedom. The Freedom Convoy. Freedom. What kind of freedom? Freedom is kind of the far right's brand. That's a central part of their messaging. But when they say that, what do they really mean? They mean specific kinds of freedoms. Freedom from any obligation to be vaccinated if they're going to be in a public indoor space, or wear a mask. Free from any obligation to protect the people around them as best they can. The freedom to exploit workers at will. Freedom to pollute at will. Have the unlimited right to pillage the Earth's resources. The freedom to avoid paying taxes. These billionaires and major corporations pay little, if any, taxes. That's the kind of freedom they want. They don't mean reproductive freedom. They don't mean freedom to organize a labor union. They'll fire you. Many of these big corporations, if you try to organize a labor union. Elon Musk, a big supporter of the Freedom Convoy, he certainly doesn't support freedom for his workers at Tesla to organize. He's fired them. He moved the company to Texas to cut down on their taxes. These people don't care about workers. They don't care about their financial security or their working conditions or their safety at work, obviously, which vaccine and mask mandates are part of. They're against any sort of closure of non-essential work places during pandemic surges, because that cuts into their profits. And there's a reason why, when you look at the demands of these protests, there were not any workplace demands that were actually specifically relevant to truckers. They didn't address grievances that truckers in Canada actually have relating to wages and working conditions. So in short, the so-called Freedom Convoy, in Canada, or similar incarnations elsewhere, it's not a movement for the rights of either truckers or any other group of workers. It's a movement for a certain faction of the ruling class, the most far-right faction of that class. All right, well, that's all for today's episode of The Bitter Pill. I will see you next time.